Retirement Lifestyle Show is back with a brand new episode. I'm your co-host, Adrian Nicholson, and I'm joined by my fellow co-host, Roshan Loungani. Roshan, what's the topic that we're going to discuss today?
I'm excited about this one and glad to have another episode going for us, but it's the data center build out. And as our listeners that have been with us for years can see, we've really shifted a little bit with more of a focus on the investing side of things. Whereas I think before we had a better balance between the planning and the investing side. I think what's happened over time is I think there, when we focus on the investing side, I feel like it lines up with what we're doing, where we're spending our time and opportunities that I think a lot of our listeners can get actionable steps to advance their research process and their investing process. So with the data centers, there just appears to be a huge opportunity. This isn't new, it's all driven from AI, but some numbers that are just that I want to throw out there, right? The 14 largest publicly owned data center operators will spend $750 billion in 2026, up from $450 billion in 25. The four US hyperscalers, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Meta, are going to spend, they've guided for 635 to 665 billion in 2026 capex, the largest peacetime industrial mobilization in US history. Amazon's capex alone of around 200 billion is greater than the entire publicly traded US energy sector. The hyperscalers that I mentioned earlier, they're committing almost 100% of their operating cash flows to this build out, whereas their 10-year average is only 40% of their operating cash flows that they spend on capital expenditures. Over 23 gigawatts of data center capacity was under construction globally at the end of 2025, end of September 2025. Three quarters of that's the US. So these data centers, another way to look at it is they're AI factories. So when you hear that this is the fourth industrial revolution in the AI space, I think if you look at data centers as the factories, it'll change the perspective a little bit. What are your thoughts, Adrian?
Yeah, I would just start with a little bit, just a background and like a story. For our listeners and viewers that don't know, I'm originally from Loudoun County. I pretty much grew up my whole life there. And then right around the time, like when I was in high school and university, all around in like Loudoun County, all these big, buildings, windowless buildings were starting to pop up everywhere. And I felt like every time like I went back home, I'm just starting to see these big, windowless buildings, which ended up being the data centers. And I think that's, something where, you got to see it to believe it. You're hearing all these like data centers popping up, and next thing you know, all of a sudden your neighbor is like a data center. And one thing researching this topic, they're kind of comparing this like build out to data centers to fuel the AI demand to railroads and the telecommunication build out. That's how they're kind of comparing it. So when you make those kind of comparison, that's like, a huge, opportunity. It gets people's attention and it draws a lot of like conversations and interest. And I think that's just something too, as like an investor, that you have to look at and be aware of, because again, there could be a potential opportunity for you there.
And being in Virginia, where we are, we're at the heart of it now. For you in Loudoun County, you've lived through the entirety of this change, right? And now it's expanding not only here, but the areas are shifting, right? Where the new areas are in Texas, Louisiana, Ohio, and Mississippi. Now we're still growing in Virginia too, but what they're looking for are places with cheap land and either gas or nuclear access. So you've got it
Yeah.
expanding into these others as well.
Yeah, exactly. And you think about like just the practical use case, like these data centers, like why they so important. Like obviously the most important thing is, they are fueling the AI demand, but these data centers are used for like a number of things. Like if you're streaming, if you're watching like videos online, that's where the feed and the connection comes from these data centers. Websites, cloud computing, anything that's related to the internet is being sent through these data centers. So that's where you can kind of see like the use case and application case and how it's impacting people's everyday life. I mean, everybody relies on these things on a daily basis, and that's why you're seeing so much money go through and invested in these areas because, again, a lot of consumers, businesses, and individuals use this in their everyday life.
Yeah, and I'm trying to see if I can put that into context in terms of electricity usage versus the TV versus the movie, that you had just said. It says 1 hour of streaming uses zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.6 kilowatts when it's in HD, whereas as the AI, that's the equivalent of roughly 1,000 to 3,000 AI prompts. If you're like me, that doesn't mean too much in terms of AI prompts. Streaming is definitely more. I think the thing is that AI prompts are going to be used more frequently than streaming because theoretically they could use by people all day, every day. Here's another comparison though. A hyperscale AI campus will draw 500 megawatts to 1 gigawatt of power, whereas an old data center is only at 25 megawatts of power. So, that is 20 to 40 times the use, right? And Meta has a Prometheus campus in Ohio that's going to be at least 1 gigawatt. And Mark Zuckerberg says he plans to build tens of gigawatts this decade and hundreds of gigawatts over time. When you go back to looking at where AI has progressed, the backlog at one point were the chips, right? It was you couldn't get the Nvidia chips that you wanted. There was a black market for selling them, etc. Well, right now and I said backlog, a better word is bottleneck. Right now the bottleneck seems to be power. Power is the constraint right now, not chips, not money, and that will we just need to expand the electricity that's available in order to resolve this.
Yeah, that's a good point. Originally, if you asked me that question, like what could be like the bottleneck, obviously on the top of my list, I would just think it would be, like you mentioned, like power, electricity, water is a big one now too. I also got to imagine too, again, going back to my story growing up in Loudoun County, also land. I mean, there's only a finite amount of land and companies are fighting over it, trying to expand. Obviously, there's regulation. They have to go through government. There's a whole process to go through it. So that's just another thing where, again, it's just going to be something every year. There's going to be like a new story or a new like issue or new things that, investors or businesses have to consider in this space. And it's just going to be really fascinating just to see how it works.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with those other areas like the land or the water. I think that uh, they might be a little bit further down the road in terms the water in particular. Land, you've got to look at now. Um, one one other interesting data point is Microsoft has 80 billion unfulfilled Azure backlog because it can't find the electricity to power the GPUs they already have. So, they have the GPUs, they just don't have the power. So it's sitting there. Just another data point. Another one for you is Sightline Climate found that 12 gigawatts of new data center demand was announced in 2026. That's demand, but only about a third have broken ground. There's a 7 gigawatt shortfall that just can't be delivered right now. So it'll take time for this shortage to be resolved, and this for an investor could lead to opportunities.
Yeah, and I think also something interesting for like our listeners and viewers to think about is there's a lot of different ways you can invest in this space. And I think that's what we'll get into later on in this podcast. I mean, what we've talked about already, like energy uses, data centers, AI, applications, like cloud, all this stuff really just ties in together, but it's a number of different ways that you can invest in it or do your research into it. And that's where I think, you know, is where the opportunity is and could provide diversification, but also just doesn't limit you to like the major headlines or the major AI companies. There are other companies out there that are not specifically tied to AI, but are part of the so-called value chain or supply chain that AI relies on or is built on.
Yeah, and that's where this power comes, right? You don't have electricity, you cannot run any of these AI models.
Exactly.
So another interesting point on this, or potential area to dig deeper and look into it, transformers, switchgear, and breakers represent less than 10% of the construction cost. However, without them, the other 90%, which are shells, cooling, like you had mentioned, water, racks, GPUs, can't be energized. So a $2 billion campus will just sit there waiting on a $40 million transformer order. A lot of these are made out of China, so then you've got to deal with tariffs as well right now.
Yeah, that's another good one to put. And I guess I just have like a quick question that maybe like our listeners and viewers will have for you, Roshan. Like you always say, they need to do their research, they need to do their homework. And when it goes to this like AI, understanding it, understanding the data centers, the energy that goes into it, it can get very complicated. Just the terms alone, when you're talking about, transformers, GPUs, CPUs, data centers, it makes it seem like our listeners and viewers need to have like some IT background to even understand the space, let alone to invest in it. I would just say myself, I don't have like the best IT background. I remember in university, one of my assignments was to create a web page, and that was very difficult and kept me up at night. So, let alone trying to understand how AI, data centers, and all that works, definitely will take some time just to learn because obviously learning is really important because that's the part that gets you confident to invest in this space.
Yeah, I agree. It can be intimidating. The acronyms, learning these things. As you brought this up, it just reminds me of Warren Buffett has multiple quotes on this, but he would always say, one of his quotes is, it's on success. You don't need to be a genius to do this job. You need the right orientation. And I think what he's referring to there is more the behavioral finance side. Don't necessarily chase the crowd or the fad. And there are definitely people out there that would argue that what we're talking about today is chasing the crowd and the fad. I'm not in that camp because I do believe this build out is real and here to stay. However, to what you had said and what Buffett said, when I suggest go do your homework, I'm not suggesting you need to go get any kind of advanced degree in technology. Especially now, the information is out there on the internet. You can just research it and read. And going a little bit deeper into the topic we're talking about today, you can find that AI will help expedite the process. So while you're doing your research, you can do it on AI, and you can, if you have a question, like they give you an acronym you don't know or something you don't understand about technology, you can just ask and it'll explain it to you. I remember once I had a old manager 20 plus years ago that would say, like, explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old. And I wrote that in an AI prompt once, explain to me like a 5-year-old, meaning I want it simplified. AI came back with like a children's story to explain it literally to a 5-year-old. So you've got to be careful about the prompts you use. My point in that, though, is you can get the explanation no matter what age, IQ level, or background. And it's really pretty easily available right now to you. So, and when I say do your homework, what that to me means is, at least for me, I don't feel comfortable really investing in something till I've done the research. And I've tried to in the past look at other services, and I will still today use other services to enhance my research. By other services, I mean other research firms. But until I've done the research myself, I don't necessarily feel fully comfortable. And I'm just suggesting that the person listening do the research so they feel fully comfortable.
No, that's a great point. And I would just like kind of add on this. I thought the Warren Buffett story you're going to go with, and I believe this is like a Warren Buffett one. And I believe he was like talking to Bill Gates. And like Bill Gates was saying, computers are so awesome. They're so great. You got to invest in it. It looks so cool. It does this, it does that. And then Warren Buffett was like, this is so complicated. Like, I'm investing in like bubble gum. That concept is like more common. It's easy for me to understand. And that was like a good explanation to basically like what we're talking about. But the part that I wanted to add on to this was that, and we talked about this before, like every like investor has like their competitive advantage or their competitive niche that we talked about, where, you know, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of different areas you can invest in and look in when it comes to these data centers, AI. And we're talking about how energy is one. Maybe that's a space that people are very comfortable in or know a lot about. So maybe they start to research there. Maybe somebody's a little bit more tech savvy or understands it more and likes, you know, more of like the data center play or the AI applications that are arriving right now. So I guess that's a good place to start and definitely see where you are comfortable as an investor. You know more that maybe that's the direction you can head off.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. Lynch has talked about that. Peter Lynch about invest in what you know, and I'll look at things investment wise sometimes, and I'll say, what's my edge? What do I know that the other person doesn't? And the other term you'll hear investing too is it's a zero sum game, meaning when you buy something, someone is selling it. So even though you think something's going to go up, there's someone who doesn't agree with you or they wouldn't be selling it to you, right? So I do think there are areas where you can get your edge with circle of competence. That being said, I do think you can build your circle of competence and expand your circle of competence through research and study, right? So and that's what I say when I say do your homework. I think you can build it. Your story on Buffett, by the way, I've heard something similar, but Buffett did eventually start using computers to play bridge. And he became pretty good at it. So that's showing that he expanded his circle of competence there. Now, I've argued before that when Buffett invested in Apple, it was more of a cash cow than a tech company. So I stand by that, but it does show that he expanded his circle of competence to a place where he felt comfortable putting money for whatever reason to a technology based firm. So I think that story is a good illustration of the point of do your homework and do the research, even if it's an area that you might not feel comfortable with, because I think you can learn in that space.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point. So, where do you want to lead off next with this conversation? I mean, what I'm thinking about right now, too, is like, you know, with something like this, the conversation arrives of, you know, is it still too early to look into this space or is it too late to look into this space? Or are we somewhere in the middle? Again, going back to what you just mentioned about Warren Buffett, it definitely took him some time to start like warming up to understand like, okay, computers are like here to stay. But at that point, you know what I mean, opportunities come and go. So what do you think about that, Dave?
Well, I definitely don't think it's too early, right? In the sense that a lot of these stocks have taken off and are up. Some of the companies in this data center, specifically, if you're getting into the shortage of power in the data center build out, if that's where you're looking at, a lot of these stocks have gone up a lot. So I would definitely not say it's too early. As far as if it's too late, that's where the homework piece comes into play, because I think it is too late for some, right? Where some, based on their growth metrics and their valuation, look too expensive for me. But overall, I think you can find opportunities if you dig deep.
I agree.
Yeah, a couple other things, just to mention. You had mentioned, is it too early or too late? There are definitely people that are saying we're in a bubble, and that the bubble, we're in a bubble and the bubble will burst. I wonder, with this electricity piece that we're talking about, with the data center build out and the need for the electricity to provide it, because I think our electricity usage isn't just AI driven. AI is making it move faster, but we use electricity for everything from computer, TV, electric vehicles, you name it. So I is definitely accelerating the need and making us push forward. However, to me, going back to the thoughts on if there is a bubble, I guess I'm saying there could be, but I'm trying to find some areas that I think are that to me feel safer. What are your thoughts on the bubble in this space, right?
So the two risks that I see out there that could say, hey, yeah, this is a bubble. So the first one was an overbuild out, which is, very simple. Are we just going to build like way too many data centers? Is just going to be spending too much money in the wrong direction? So that's number one. The second one is, and I don't have too much information on this, it's like a cyclical cycle or a cyclical moment where there's like a slowdown. Or is it just going to be like a straight line up and to the right, just going to be continue growth, continue spending? Or will there be like pockets of slowdown where you have like periods of underperformance? So those are the two things that I think about when you hear the word, are we in a bubble, and what could potentially pop that bubble or cause, a slowdown or
Yeah,
decline.
and the first one you had mentioned of, are we going to overbuild or build? Are we going to build too much in the space? I mean, to me, that is a real risk. However, I don't think we're anywhere near that. Just once again, in the context of this shortage of electricity, shortage of compute. Now, the other thought, though, that comes to mind when you talk about the overbuild is that these models are getting more efficient, right? So could they get their efficiency levels to a point where they don't use or need as much power? That to me is I think that actually is to a certain degree inevitable. Let's see, time will prove if I'm right or wrong. But the fact that technology gets more efficient, I think that just happens, right, over time. And if it gets more efficient and uses less power, that's where I think with this data center build out and this electricity shortage to build it out that we've talked about could be at risk. However, to me, that feels like it's years away based on the spend. In addition to that, when you're trying to bring more electricity onto the grid, that takes years to build a facility that can do this, right? So, we didn't really touch on this too much, but this whole data center build out and this need for compute has caused a bit of a renaissance in nuclear power, right? And nuclear power, I think the last facility to build, I don't have the number in front of me, but I think it was over 10 years the last time a new nuclear facility was built, and it ended up costing more money.
Yeah, and then just giving a little bit more context to our listeners and viewers, where you mentioned more efficient technology that will help with like the energy shortage. I think when I was looking at my research, it said efficient semiconductor chips because that's really what fuels these data centers and fuels AI. If you get more efficient semiconductor chips, that'll help with the energy usage and consumption. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to ask because I have not seen this. Is there a breakthrough there with chips using less power?
I don't think there is now, but that's something, that's just going to continue to be watched by investors, and more research and development is going to go into because, I feel like there's a new semiconductor chip that's, better than ever, every year that they talk about. And that's something too that's
Hmm.
pretty much the backbone on it. So the
Yeah.
second thing I was going to mention is what you talked about. It's just, nuclear, electricity, water, land. When I think of all these categories, I really start thinking about, okay, this is where, future regulation is going to be extremely important. And that's something too that could have a significant impact on this industry as well. It's not like companies can just, build wherever they want, use all the energy that they want, because with that comes, a lot of questions from like government communities saying, hey, how is this going to impact like our areas, our constituents for like the long term that could have an impact. And as we know, elections could have a significant impact on that, and changes with that could also impact that environment. There's a third thing I want to talk about as well, but is there anything that you want to interject at some things I just brought up?
No, I think you bring up an interesting point with the political aspect. I did find the information on that nuclear plant just because I think it's worth sharing. The last nuclear plant built came online in April of 24. It took 11 years of physical construction and 15 years from initial application. It ended up finishing more than 20 billion over budget. So they had initially said it'd be 14 billion. It ended up being 36.8 billion. So going back to a moment to what we discussed earlier about technological efficiencies and over construction, almost reversing or creating a trap, so to speak, for investors, the people that are building in the space. It just takes so long. I think that that risk is, though it's real, I think it's on the lower end for me of risk. Now, technological improvements lowering the use, I'm more concerned about. But Adrian, please continue.
So the third thing that I wanted to talk about is I want to look at this from more from like a global lens. If you think about the three major players in this area or regions, what comes to mind is the United States, Europe, and China. And what I could kind of compare this or think about, even though I wasn't alive during this time, it seems very much like a space race back then, where now it's more of like an AI race. Who can, get the data centers up? Who can figure out the energy issue? Who can have the best chips? Who can have the best like application? And who can really be like first and out in front? Because if you're out in front, that's where the money's going to start flowing. So that's something too as an investor that you have to do your research on and see where you want to invest because are you going to look domestically, internationally? Are you going to diversify across the globe? That's a conversation you need to look into as well or have because this is a very real thing that's going on where a lot of money is being spent not just in the US but across the globe.
Yeah, and I think you described it really well with the AI race. I think that's a good way to put it. That's what's going on, and uh, we as in the United States are a little ahead. It says that we're ahead in the um, we're ahead in the large language models and hardware space with the chips, but um, uh, China is a little ahead of us in the robotics side of things.
Yeah. I mean, that's the fourth part that I want to add with this. That means there's geopolitical risk that gets, baked into this as well. So it's a very complex backdrop, but it's something that you really need to think about, especially when if you think about allocating, your portfolio to this sector. This is where you have to consider a lot of different risk out there that normally you may not have to. You just have to look, domestically or at a sector that's not related to this. So think that's something too that you have to look at and just like be aware of. I mean, the two kind of like stories that I'm thinking about, both of them really just like relate to China. I mean, like one, there was like a US person like giving them information or chips. The second one is like the issue of like China and the relationship with Taiwan. Is that like a risk that could impact this? So there are very real headlines that are coming out and practical that show you how geopolitical risk plays a factor if you're investing in this space.
I mean, when you mentioned the China Taiwan risk, and that was Warren Buffett and his team. We talked about him earlier. Got invested in Taiwan Semiconductor, and they got out really early. Like Taiwan Semiconductor is right now at $410 plus as we speak. They got out, I believe it was under 100, and I think they got in the 80s. And the reason they got out was the geopolitical risk there, which I think is very real, right? So uh, a lot of risk factors are involved in there. Where that's what, when as we discuss this, things like that is why I always go back to that statement of do your homework. It's not, you've got to decide if what risk you're comfortable with. So in this example, you've got Buffett, the greatest investor of all time, saying, I'm just not comfortable with the geopolitical risk. I'll go elsewhere, right? And
Yeah.
that feeling might not be the same for you.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add on that when we say like do your research and do your homework, sometimes you can find a really good company, very strong valuations. If you're technical, a good chart, all that looks good. But again, something like a geopolitical risk, is that something that you ignore, can impact your investment thesis on investing in a certain company or space. So that's something too where it can get very high level in advance when it comes to looking at that. But this is things that we just want to talk about and discuss so you're just aware of, just like another tool to your investment toolbox.
Yep. Yep. That's what we want to do. Make you better investors and try to help you find some opportunities to look into to decide if you want to invest in them or not. Just, some sectors of industries that this is impacting. I'll just throw some out there, independent power producers, regulated utilities that are in the areas where data centers are being built, nuclear, natural gas and midstream, grid and electrical equipment, cooling, like you mentioned earlier with the water, construction, engineering, materials, chips, GPUs and accelerators, foundries, memory, network and connectivity, data center real estate, cloud operators. These are a lot, but they aren't the entirety of the list of areas that are impacted by this. So, there's a lot of you can pick which of those areas you're most comfortable with and decide to dive deep into, or where you feel the most opportunities lie. So there is, to me, it looks like there's a very real opportunity in this data center build out that investors can take advantage of. And my personal opinion is it's not too late. Adrian, what are your thoughts on that? You had asked me that question very early on. What are your thoughts on, is it too early? Is it too late? Or is the timing just right?
I would say we're in the middle innings, like you said, based on how companies have been moving in the stock market in this space. I'd say valuations are definitely catching up or starting to be priced in. But again, I think there are still, if you think back to like the dot-com boom, a lot of those companies really got wiped out. And it wasn't until a couple years later, some of the companies that people are invested into today come out on the scene. So I still think there could be new companies that arrive that, aren't out there yet, where it makes me kind of confident saying, yeah, we're no longer in the early innings. I mean, AI has definitely been something that's been talked about. People have been using and getting a lot of attention from investors since like late 2022. So now I think we're definitely at a point where you're starting to get a little bit more clarity on where the money's going, where the industry is heading, who are some of the dominant players are going to be. But I don't think it's, the late stage because, again, so much money is being spent in this space. We're getting a lot of earnings coming out right now. They're saying, they're hitting on all the numbers. So they're actually showing years of consistent
Yeah.
performance, which is really good. So that's where my outlook is. I kind of want to drop like a little bit more of like a bonus part and more, this is me just like speculating. And this is something too that got attention towards the end of last year. But I'm wondering too if companies that are building these data centers, trying to fill this AI demand, are also trying to also build some support for future quantum computing. I think quantum computing is definitely in the early stage, but like the last thing you want to do is just put all your eggs in one basket with AI and have all these data centers that can support AI, but not quantum computing. It could just be a very niche space, too early to tell. But I think that's also too something that got a lot of attention last year. That's not getting as much attention this year that I think could be, you know, helpful if these data centers not only support AI but also quantum computing.
Yeah, and to what you had said earlier, when we were talking about the risks on this electricity area, need for electricity, if quantum does take off, they use less electricity, right? So that could be a way to solve the AI issue. The electricity need would be if they run on quantum. I have no idea how far out that is in terms of years. What are you hearing or seeing about?
I guess what I'm getting at is like I'm just kind of hopeful that if they're going to be spending all this, money in data centers and AI, if my future neighbor is going to be a data center, I hope it has like a lot of like flexibility and different use cases other than solely just AI. And that's where obviously these people are experts, are spending trillions of dollars of the space. So I think they're really looking way down the road, but also in the short term where it's just me kind of speculating, and it's hard to see right now. But what other use cases or how else can these data centers support other technological advances other than AI?
Well, now just playing this out, the electricity need would go down. However, the data center need would not go down if we shift to quantum, right? So, yeah, and for those of you listening, this is sort of how we look at and figure out what we want to look into. And not that I've shifted thoughts on this at all, but maybe if you look at this and you think, well, quantum will be here sooner than later, and you want to be a part of this data center build out investment theme, you might want to avoid electricity if you think quantum will be here sooner than later, and look at some of the other areas that we discussed. I mentioned all those different categories. I won't go through all of them again, but if we still need, like Adrian, actually, going back to what you mentioned with quantum, cooling is currently an issue, and please let me know if this has changed. My information has got to be 6 months to a year old, but the level they need to keep the temperature they need to keep those quantum chips at are so cold that cooling becomes an issue. So then if you're thinking about quantum being a breakthrough, maybe that's an area you look at in this build out, is the cooling side versus the electricity side. By no means is this a recommendation. It's just sort of trying to figure out where to focus your time and research based on your thoughts on where things are headed.
No, I definitely agree. Maybe that can be a future topic to go into. Definitely need to brush up on the latest updates on quantum computing. I definitely looked into a lot, last year and thought that was a good opportunity. I definitely have to brush up on my research on it. But again, it's just something that's in the back of my mind where, a lot of money is being spent in the technology industry. And, things are changing so rapidly on a month by month, quarter by quarter, year by year basis. You definitely want to make sure, however you're positioned, you're able to take advantage of any new things that come out or any new opportunities that lie ahead.
Yeah, and as you mentioned the quantum space, I'm just looking at one of the companies in the space right now. I was thinking back as you said it of our question of, is it too early or too late? Well, quantum has had so much volatility that depending on how you look at it, there may be opportunities. And I'm looking at this at a chart of a company in the space, and it was back in, I think it went public through SPAC in 2021 at $10, went all the way up to 28, dropped all the way down to 3 in 2023, and last year in 2020, late 24, it went all the way up to $44, dropped all the way back down to 25. In 2025, it went up to $75 almost, dropped all the way down to 29. So there's enough volatility in the quantum space where I think the risk of, if you think you're too early, you'll probably get another chance at it as the prices move up and down.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, and I think I said too early. I think it would be, if you think you're too late, there might be another opportunity. But this has been a great episode. I'm really excited to talk about the data center build out and the current bottleneck with electricity. We'll be back with another great episode. Please like, subscribe, give us 5 stars, take control, and achieve your goals.
Schedule a conversation with Roshan, Adrian, or Eric today at retirementlifestyleshow.com. Roshan and Eric are certified financial planner practitioners. They, along with Adrian, are investment advisor representatives and serve clients across the U.S. with financial planning and investment advice through Arete Wealth. If you found this show helpful, gained knowledge, or enjoyed the time you spent with us, tell your friends and leave us a 5-star review. This will help others discover the show. To access our show notes, to download any of the tools mentioned in today's podcast, to ask us a question, or to schedule a conversation, go to retirementlifestyleshow.com. All opinions expressed by podcast hosts and guests are solely their own. While based on information they believe is reliable, neither Arete Wealth nor its affiliates warrants its completeness or accuracy, nor do their opinions reflect the opinion of Arete Wealth. This podcast is for general informational purposes only and should not be regarded as specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Before making any decisions, consult a professional. The show hosts offer investment advice through Arete Wealth Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor, and securities through Arete Wealth Management, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC, and NFA. Finally, our music is The Chance by Jason Shaw and Audionautics. It's part of the YouTube audio library, and it's licensed under a Creative Commons license. I am Ray Voices. Thank you for listening.